Welcome to Stab the Dragon Productions for episode number 239 for a new series called Intro to Whiskey. Coming to you from Fort Worth, Texas, where it was 66 degrees on Wednesday, January 21st, 2026, but the Iceman cometh. There are scores, hundreds, maybe even thousands of videos on the subject of what is whiskey out here on the internet. So I am doing this series for myself, for the love of studying and the love of this subject, to improve my own personal understanding of whiskey. Now, if you want to join me on this journey and join in the conversation, great. I'll be sharing my research, my experience, and asking questions, sharing my opinions, and experimenting along the way. So if you make it all the way through to the end of this video today, there is some practical application at the end. Because also this week, 2 days ago, the 19th of January, was the first anniversary of the implementation of the American Single Malt Act. And so I'm going to be celebrating while doing this video, drinking an American single malt. This is Acre, Texas single malt whiskey from here in Fort Worth. Acre Distillery is about 12 minutes from my house. And this is single barrel number 111. This has been finished in an English strong ale barrel. So it's finished in a beer cask, basically. And look at how dark that is. That is a Texas single malt right there. And that is amazing. All right, my first question is, what is whiskey? Now, I was raised in a strict teetotaler household in the fundamentalist wing of the Southern Baptist Church, where alcohol was preached against because it was evil. We even used Welch's grape juice in communion. I knew generally that the progression of alcohol was beer, wine, and then distilled spirits like whiskey, but I didn't know anything scientifically about it at all, other than a few sips of wine at some weddings I participated in. I had no alcohol until I was 52 years old. My first beer, I kid you not. My first whiskey was a couple of years later, so I was about 54. So I will discuss the moral and biblical issues of alcohol in a later video. Right now, I want to focus on the science and history part of the equation to answer the question, what is whiskey? But even a discussion of science and history must have some theological, biblical, philosophical roots. I'm convinced that we live in a theocentric universe. There is a creator God, and I believe the Bible is God's revelation of himself to man. And science is God's idea, in that he gave man a mind that will seek to understand and apply creation. So math, physics, biology, chemistry are all a part of God's creation. And whiskey is the end result of a lot of science, a lot of experimentation and technology. So it is both natural and man-made. In itself, whiskey is a good thing that reflects the goodness of God. Now, how you use it, what you do with it, that's where the morals and the ethics enter in. But the science of whiskey shows it to be a good thing and therefore worthy of studying. Now, it's a strong thing, so it also requires discipline, patience, and sound judgment, self-restraint. So let's ask the question again, what is whiskey? Whiskey is a liquid that is the distillate of grain, water, and yeast that has been fermented, producing alcohol. Grain that is soaked in water and let to stand will naturally ferment if done properly. That produces what we call beer. The level of alcohol in beer can go between about 4 to 10% usually, plus or minus some. And distilling is a process of bringing the beer to the point where the alcohol boils off, evaporates into a gas, is captured and condenses back into a liquid again. And at that point, the condensate is much higher in alcohol than the content of the beer. So essentially, it removes and concentrates the alcohol that's in the liquid that is the beer. Whiskey can be made from any grain: barley, corn, rye, wheat, rice, other grains. Usually, a whiskey is made with at least some of the grain being malted. Now, what is malted? You might think of malto meal, the cereal when you were a kid, right? Malting grain means that the dried grain has been moistened with water so that the inner part of the grain begins to come alive, to germinate, which will lead to sprouting and then growing into a plant. So malting is the chemical process of bringing the dormant grain back to life. For whiskey making, you want some of the grain at least, or maybe all of it, to begin that malting process. Why? It releases the sugars and the enzymes in the grain, which is needed for fermentation. However, you want to stop the malting process before the grain goes too far and begins to sprout. So you moisten it to cause it to malt, and then if you get your timing down right, you dry the grain so it stops the malting process, and then you grind it up into a grist and you mix it with water and yeast at just the right temperature, and it begins to ferment. So you're kind of making homemade bread in a way. The yeast is consuming the sugars, and then it produces alcohol. You will see that term malt often. And malt, the term malt is both a verb and a noun. It is normally in this context used as a noun, meaning the malted barley. So if you say somebody says, hey, this is a single malt, that means this whiskey is made from malted barley alone. So there it's a noun, it's a malt. The term single malt then is very popular in the whiskey world, and you will see that a lot. But when you study the ingredients of even a bourbon like this, you may find that the list of ingredients includes malted barley. Although this one actually has no barley. So, but let me see. This one has got barley. All right, and it's usually going to be malted barley, because the malting process gives power to the yeast to create alcohol. And so you want a little bit of malt, usually in your whiskey mash, and it helps the process along. Now, whiskeys today are typically placed in oak barrels or casks after it goes through the still, and you've got the distillate that's pure alcohol. You want to age that. And so whiskey fresh out of the still can be consumed, and it's sometimes called moonshine or white lightning, white whiskey, but it's clear and colorless. And it's got a little taste to it. It's a simple taste that comes from the dominant grain used to make it. But when whiskey is aged in oak barrels, the wood gives whiskey all of its color and a lot more of the taste and flavor. If the oak barrel has been charred on the inside, it imparts even more color and taste. And if the barrel has previously been used for something else, whatever was in the barrel before remains there and imparts even some of that flavor to the whiskey. So there's lots of ways to add flavor to that white lightning. The word whiskey comes to us from the Gaelic language, think Ireland and Scotland, which they descended from the Celtics, the Celts. The Gaelic form is uisge, and then another word, beathe, ushka beta, or water of life. You may see the word spelled differently by different brands. In general, the American and Irish brands use the term whiskey, and Scotch and Canada use the term whisky. So there's an EY and there's a Y. And that doesn't, that's just a choice that people make. And individual brands in America may leave out the E. So, that's just the way people want to spell it. Some American brands, have something else like a Tennessee whiskey. Okay, and so this is not just whiskey. This is a Tennessee whiskey, right? Or this is a bourbon whiskey. And so you're going to have a modifier put onto that name whiskey, and that will, or a Scotch whiskey. So there's going to be ways of defining the whiskey, and we'll get into that now. In general, all whiskeys have the same general components in their manufacture: grain, water, yeast, but they acquire the different names usually from the nation of origin and what type of whiskey and what type of production they use. So here are some of the types. Let's start with Scotch. This is whiskey made in Scotland, and if it's not made in Scotland, it can't be called Scotch. So this is still whiskey, but it is Scotch whiskey. There are different types of Scotch whiskey. This Glenlivet here is a single malt. That means it is made exclusively from malted barley at one distillery in one season. That's a single malt. But there's blended malts, which are a blend of single malts from two or more distillers. There are single grain whiskeys made from other grains like corn, rye, or wheat. Those are also Scotch if they're made in Scotland. But most single grain whiskeys are used to assist in the making of the most popular form of Scotch, called the blended Scotch, which I have here. This is a blended Scotch, so it has some single malts in there and some single grains in there. So it's a blend of different kinds of Scotch whiskey. So this is a blended Scotch, but it's a Scotch. So famous brands include Johnnie Walker, Chivas Regal, J&B, Glenlivet, the Macallan, Highland Park. These are names that you're going to hear and you're going to see in the Scotch world. Irish whiskies. This is whiskey made in Ireland. The Irish whiskies are generally known for being triple distilled and made in copper pot stills, although not all of them are. While the Irish do have some single malts, most of their whiskies are an Irish blend that has a higher content of unmalted barley. Now, that tradition started 300 years ago because of a tax the British government placed on malted barley. And so to get around paying the tax, the Irish used unmalted barley. There you go. Government leads to people getting around government. The Scots usually use double distilling, and the Irish usually use triple distilling. Triple distilling makes whiskeys even more smooth, more gentle, milder, but some say it actually strips out some of the flavors as well. Some evidence points to the first whiskey being made in Ireland, though some say perhaps it was Scotland, but I think most sources are going to say that it was the Irish monks who developed the first whiskey in the 12th century. Irish whiskey today must be made in Ireland, at least 40% ABV, and aged in oak for 3 years minimum. Famous brands include Jameson, right here, Redbreast, Green Spot, Paddy's, St. Patrick's here. So there's lots and lots of brands of Irish whiskey, just like Scotch. All right, Canadian whiskey must be mashed, distilled, and aged in Canada. And that, again, comes in at least 40% ABV, aged in oak for at least 3 years. So you see that 3-year mark and the 40% mark in Scotch, Irish, and Canadian. Generally speaking, Canadian whiskeys are blends where each grain is mashed, fermented, and aged separately, then blended together after aging and bottled. So there's a slightly different process. Canadian whiskeys, like Scotch and Irish, may also include some food coloring, and even in Canada, they can add some flavoring to Canadian whiskeys. Famous brands include Crown Royal, or Canadian Club in this case, or Black Velvet. United States whiskeys. Bourbon. Let's start off with bourbon. Here we go. Bourbon must be made in the United States from a mash bill that is at least 51% corn. The rest can be wheat, barley, or rye, sometimes even rice. It's got to be made in America. It's got to be aged in charred new oak barrels, but there's no length of time required to be bourbon. So Irish, Scotch, and Canadian require 3 years. America, no time limit is given. No minimum time limit is given. It could be a 1 day, right? The bourbon must be also, like the other whiskeys, 40% ABV or 80 proof. To be called a straight bourbon, though, it must be aged at least 2 years. Bourbon is considered the national spirit of America. Famous brands include Jim Beam, or here, Old Grandad, Wild Turkey, Maker's Mark, Evan Williams. Bourbon. Rye whiskey. Another United States product. Rye whiskey must be made in the United States from a mash bill that is at least 51% rye, aged again in new charred oak barrels and proofed at 80 proof, 40% ABV. Famous brands include Wild Turkey, Knob Creek here, Old Overholt, Old Forester. Tennessee whiskeys. Tennessee whiskeys must be made in Tennessee, and they must use the Lincoln County process of chill filtration through sugar maple charcoal. The whiskey must be 51% corn and have 80 proof, being aged in new charred oak barrels. Essentially, this is a bourbon that is made in Tennessee and is filtered through the sugar maple charcoal process, the Lincoln County process. Jack Daniels and George Dickel are examples of Tennessee whiskey. American single malts. This is the newest category. I mentioned that at the start of the show. Just went into effect a little over a year ago. And American single malts, again, must be made in the US of A. Here's an American single malt. They are made of 100% malted barley at one single distillery. Again, 80 proof or 40% ABV at least. Aged in oak barrels, but it's not specified. It doesn't have to be new charred oak barrels. There can be uncharred or used barrels. Famous brands include Balcones, Westland, Stranahan's. American single malts. Now, there are several other national types of whiskeys. But this is enough for a general overview. And I don't want to get into all the different international types of whiskeys, but there are. There's Mexican whiskeys, Japanese whiskeys. I've got a whiskey from Denmark. I mean, there's Indian whiskeys. So there's whiskeys in every country almost. So let's talk about best-selling whiskeys. In the Scotch whiskey world, Johnnie Walker blended Scotch is the leading seller of all Scotch everywhere. And the best-selling Irish whiskey brand is Jameson. The best-selling Canadian brand is Crown Royal. Don't have a bottle of that available. And the best-selling American whiskey is Jack Daniels. The best-selling bourbon in America is Jim Beam. I don't have a Jim Beam bourbon here with me at the moment. So those are some of the best-selling whiskeys in the world. Best-selling rye is apparently bullet rye. Okay, application. What do you want to do with all this information? If you're interested in exploring whiskey, I suggest a methodical, disciplined approach. Do you have a specific national whiskey that you're interested in? You can start there, but slowly work your way around the whole. Do not write off any genre or brand until you've studied it a little bit and compared it with others. You may not like one type of whiskey at first, but if you're studying it for a while, attack it then from a different direction. You may find out that you really enjoy it. So here are some specific examples. My first whiskey was Jack Daniel's Old Number 7. And it wasn't particularly good, but neither was it bad. So, I was kind of like, it's okay. But over several months of trying it in small doses, I started to like it. And then I tried Gentleman Jack, kind of the next level up, and I liked it even better. Then I tried the single barrel Jack Daniels, and that was even better, and then I tried the rye. And so then I was really a fan of Jack Daniels. I absolutely liked it. I did the same thing with bourbon. I took to Jim Beam immediately, and then gradually went up the spectrum to their black bottle, the extra aged, their blue bottle, double oaked. I tried other bourbons like Elijah Craig, Wild Turkey, and I was a confirmed bourbon fan. Now, Scotch was a bit more difficult for me because I started with 2 single malts that my son left me when he went overseas, and this is one of them, Glenlivet. The other one was Deanston. I finished those 2 bottles and felt like Scotch was kind of useless because I came to Scotch from the bourbon world, and those are 2 very different types of whiskeys. So I was really disappointed in Scotch, but I didn't give up. I read lots of articles, I watched a lot of videos, and decided that I had gone about it all wrong. First of all, I was looking for something that tasted like bourbon, and that's a totally wrong approach. Scotch is its own animal, okay? It has its own flavor profiles. There are going to be some similarities, but I was not approaching Scotch with the right mental attitude. But also, secondly, I found out that the most Scotch consumed is blended Scotch. I started with a single malt. So then I got a bottle of this, Johnny Walker Red Label. And by the time I got halfway through the bottle over a period of weeks, my palate had changed. It had matured. And I liked it. So then I went from Johnny Walker to J&B to Cuddy Sark, some other blended Scotches, and then I came back to the single malts, and lo and behold, I am a Scotch fan now. So again, when I started this journey, I was looking for what would become my whiskey, thinking that there was some magical brand out there that I could claim was my favorite, that this was my whiskey. And many people have that. That's what they're there for. But alas, it was not to be for me. My palate had become so wide and diverse that I like a very wide range of whiskeys, as perhaps you've noticed. Now, in general, I do suggest that you start with some basic lower proof brands of reputable quality. Jack Daniel's, Jim Beam are both 80 proof. Johnny Walker and Crown Royal are 80 proof. Jameson has an 80 proof version, and they are most popular for several reasons. A lot of whiskey pros will tell you to start off with the high quality, very expensive brands. Yes, that's one way to do it, but that's the very expensive way to do it. Now, another thing that you should consider doing is if you have a good quality whiskey bar near you, go and systematically try the basics, and you try them in 3 different ways. You try them neat, you try them on ice, on the rocks, and you try them in cocktails. And that way you get a fuller, broader spectrum of what is this whiskey capable of doing. And then start comparing whiskeys. All right, I showed you my glass of a Texas single malt from Acre right there. This is the Glenlivet, the Scotch right beside me. Now notice the difference in colors. This is what the Texas climate does to a whiskey. This is what Scotland does to a whiskey that's 12 years old. This is probably aged no more than 4 years. This one's aged 12 years. there's a huge difference. What about the flavor profile? The Scotch is mild, sweet, a very delicate profile, enjoyable, a little bit malty, a little bit floral. But the Texas single malt, that's in your face. That's bold. That's earthy, woody, oaky, spicy. This has a ton of flavor and kick. And so when you start comparing types of whiskeys, that helps you figure out what they're all about and helps you decide what you like. All right, that's it for this episode of Stab the Dragon. And we'll come back again soon with part 2 of this Intro to Whiskey series. And we're going to look at Canadian whiskeys next. So stay tuned, and we'll be back in a day or two with Canadian whiskeys. Out here.